Heard about some amazing tax savings scheme that you are not doing? Well, watch on. As a business accountant, my team and I spend all day long helping business owners on their journey. And one very, very daily conversation is around that somebody has heard, so a business owner that we work with has heard from a colleague or from a friend about this thing that they're doing. And the question is, why am I not doing it? Or is this a good idea for me? And it's a great question. And I wanted to cover it off in this video because I think we've all had that kind of like FOMO, that fear of like you're missing out on something that somebody else is doing. And why is that the case? Why is my accountant not telling me this? And actually, through the YouTube channel, this is something quite common we hear with people reaching out to us, is they'll say, my accountant doesn't tell me about any of this stuff. So it is very common, and I do want to talk about really kind of 4 key areas of why this might not actually be a problem for you, or it could be a problem. So let's get into it. But before we get into it, if you do like these videos, make sure to click the subscribe button and the bell below so you get notified whenever we release more videos just like this one. So then, 4 key reasons. There are more, but I just want to talk about the most common 4 themes. So reason 1 is that the person who's told you this thing, so let's just do a scenario. Someone's told you, I put through this particular cost in my business. And you talking to them is like, well, my accountant tells me I can't do that. So why is that? Well, reason 1 is quite frankly that they just might never have been caught. They might be doing it incorrectly, but there's just never been an investigation from the revenue. I mean, if you've tried to phone the revenue in recent times, you know what the wait times are like. Imagine what the resourcing is like generally across there. It can't be that great. And as a result, I should suspect we're not seeing as many investigations as we probably should do on a lot of these self-assessments. So as a result, it could just be the case that the people have never been questioned. Because if you imagine, so the most common thing you'll hear is someone go, well, I submit my, and I'm sure there's a few of you listening to this now, but like, well, I submit my own return and it's never been checked, so it must be fine. It's not actually the case. The revenue will receive a number in a box. They don't know what the breakup is and the breakdown of that is unless they've actually investigated into your return. So them just not investigating it is not them saying we're totally cool with it. You just haven't come up for a check. So and that's very common. So it could just be it is wrong and they've just never been checked. And that's the risk. Unfortunately, in a world where even if you can come and ask for professional advice, you as the taxpayer are always the liable one. So, okay, you might be able to have recourse with the accountant if they gave you wrong advice or anything like that. But ultimately, the burden of the penalties and all the tax that might be payable if you have done something wrong rests with you. So you want to be really sure that what you're submitting is correct. So that's the first reason. And obviously the most obvious one is that they are actually doing it wrong. They just never got caught. So that's reason 1. Now, and that will quite often apply where somebody's doing their own returns. But what happens if you've reached out to an accountant or a professional, you've got someone else doing it for you? Well, this is where it gets a bit murky because we've heard plenty of times, and I've got a lot of sympathy for this. Being a business owner before I become an accountant and having to try and find one was very difficult. So one of the things that would commonly be the case is you'd hear these conflicting arguments. But if you've asked a professional and they've given you an answer, you can quite often have a situation where you've been told one thing, your friend's been told another by their accountant. So what is the deal? Well, the first and kind of the second reason is that it might just be the case that the advice is outdated. So there can be such a change of pace. I mean, I've recorded videos on the YouTube channel that a month later, there's a small tweak needed to them because a case has arrived in the tax courts, which has been made a ruling on, which actually affects the common practice that's done. So it's very common with expenses. From one year to the next, you might say to somebody, nope, you can't have this. And then a tax case goes to the courts and a ruling's made that changes that advice because you're like, well, if it was okay in that situation, therefore, if this comes up again, it's going to be okay. Tax advisors can cite that as the case that backs up their claim, like all these things. It really is a change of pace. So quite often it could be that you've asked at different times and the advice has changed. It could also be that one of the professionals is not as up to date as the other one. So that's the other thing. And it's very hard to note that, but because ultimately you would have thought if you were going to a professional and asking for advice, that it was always going to be correct. But I'm sure if you've been to the doctor and maybe you've asked for a second opinion, there's always that chance, right? That somebody's specialism or somebody's, how often they keep up to date with things is going to be different to somebody else's. So you've really got to have confidence in those answers and be happy that the person and the company they're dealing with really keep up to date with those things. So yeah, it could be just timing. It could also just be that they're getting outdated advice. The other thing with tax law, particularly with something like expenses, is realistically there's kind of one line in the tax law, that's it, that says around like it needs to be wholly and exclusively for the use of your business, etc., etc. And the rest of it's interpretation of HMRC's viewpoint and their manuals, interpretation of tax law. And it's so specific on your situation that it might be that your friend or business acquaintance are just in a different scenario. So in their case, it's a bit more justifiable than it is in yours or something like that. Case in point, if you look at some of the videos around when we've talked about personal care and costs around like Botox or medical care like physiotherapy, stuff like this, so depends on what you're actually doing in your role and what your trade is, and even more specifics, like watch those videos for some sort of insight into that. Can really depend from one person to the next whether it's more likely to be allowable. But it is an interpretation, so it may just be two different professional interpretations on different sets of scenarios. Now, all that said, reason 3 can be that in the old world of accountancy, where you kind of, particularly if you've got this arrangement where you just see your accountant once a year, in the old days you would have submitted, and some people still do this, a box of receipts to their accountant. So they think, I'm claiming all this stuff, it's in this box, I've given it away, that must be what's on my return. They're being asked to sign a return which really has all those expenses broken down into one box, and maybe, if they're lucky, a set of accounts that go with that, again with headline categories. For most business owners, they probably don't know if every single receipt was included, and it's very normal as accountants that we say to people, make sure you put what you think is relevant in. And obviously with professional people, we're going to look at certain things and say, well, yeah, that's not claimable, so that's fine, we'll disallow that. And how much of that's communicated back to the client and the owner depends on the accountancy and how that practice done, what the relationship's like, what service levels you have. So as a result, it could be that your friend or colleague during this conversation thinks they're claiming it, and actually they're not. It's just being disallowed at the other end before the numbers go into the boxes. So bear that in mind, that it can just be a perception of claiming something. It might be that actually behind the scenes, and we see that so often, someone tells us something's happening, we write to the previous accountant, get the actual accounts in detail and look at it and go, no, that wasn't happening. It was just the owner's perception was that it was. So really important piece, that one. And that's, if you'll really take care to check things, that's a lot less likely with cloud tech, because you can see the figures and you can see the detail of what you're actually submitting. And you could probably start to, if you're really keen, you could probably start to check and look at those figures against the accounts being presented and things like that and check. But ultimately, it's very difficult to know every minute detail. So it does depend on your relationship with your accountant there. And then number 4, and this is so important, we did touch on it earlier, is sometimes you'll hear this thing where your friend or business colleague will be like, we're doing this, and you'll think, why am I not doing that? And half the time it can just be, it's just not worth it in your situation. So that point I was talking about around expenses, about sometimes whether you can claim something in your business is very specific to what your trade is and what your situation is. It's also the same with whether something's just generally a good idea. So the amount of times we hear something like, my friend's doing this, why am I not? And you're like, because it makes no sense in your situation, because, I don't know, you're a higher rate taxpayer, or you're not a higher rate taxpayer, or your other half is involved with the business and as a result you can do it a different way, or like there's all these things that mean sometimes it's just not a good idea. Or someone will say, I've got this amazing tax refund, and we'll be like, why did you do that? You'd have been better off carrying the losses forward and using it against the higher tax rate. Or I'm just chucking words at you really, but there's tons of reasons why in your actual situation it's not a good idea. If that is the case though, and this is all comes back to this relationship with a professional, is just make sure that because you want to have trust in these answers, you want to have an open forum where you feel like you can debate these issues and get an answer. And as you can imagine, as professionals, I think for some professionals anyway, it can be something like, what do you mean you don't believe me? It's like, it's not you don't believe them, but you do want to have a constructive conversation around, well, why is this the case? Why could my friend be doing this and I'm not? Because sometimes you might come with a nugget that's fresh off the wagon, and actually for the professional you're dealing with, that's like, oh, actually, do you know what, in your situation that might work. So it needs to be a two-way discussion. So if it doesn't feel like that, then I think that's when you have to think about, is this the right person to be working with? But generally, yeah, you should be able to have these discussions and just make sure that you're talking it all through, because sometimes just nuggets of things can come out, even if you don't do the thing that you were there to discuss. You're like, actually, it doesn't make sense. Out of that conversation might be, this thing though could be of use, let's do this. So there are 4 kind of key reasons. So don't believe everything that you hear from your friends and your acquaintance, but do think, is this something for me? And do reach out to your accountant if you're working with them and think about it. If you're doing your own tax return, be very, very wary for the reasons we say. Ultimately, you're responsible for that. So do your research, have a look. And of course, the problem with the internet, and I do understand the irony because you're listening to a video from a dude on the internet right now, is that advice is everywhere. You've just got to make sure that you're happy with the source and know that, yeah, there's a good chance this is correct, what these people are telling me, and go from there. If you've enjoyed this video, please do share it with somebody that needs to know this info, and I'll see you in the next one.